You are listening to the Doing Motherhood podcast, where we talk all things Black mothers today. What's the goings on, listener friends? It is a new week. It's a new day. And we have a new segment to introduce. And I'm really excited about this segment. The segment is called Our Issues in the News. And with the new segment comes a new political correspondent. That's what I'm calling her because I like that. Her name is Raven Dorsey. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Raven, and then she's going and tell you a little bit about Our Issues in the News segment, and then Raven's going to join us. So Raven Dorsey is a doula and advocate born and raised in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Currently based out of the DMV area, Raven serves as a deputy director for the Paid Leave for All campaign, a national campaign fighting for the federal comprehensive paid family and medical leave policy by 2023. Yes. Raven also loves to empower and educate her community as a certified labor and postpartum care doula and serves as a scheduling and advance associate for the government. Prior to that, she was a community organizer for the Warren for President campaign in Greensboro, North Carolina, and a development associate at the Women's Law Project, where she coordinated events and fundraising efforts in the Philadelphia area. Raven completed her Master's of Social Work at the University of Pennsylvania in May 2018 and her bachelor's degree in Women and Gender Studies with a concentration in gender, sexuality, and public health from SUNY Stony Brook. So I'm so happy to introduce to you our new political consultant, Raven Dorsey. Raven, how are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. I was like smiling and cheesing during your entire intro. So thank you.
So Raven is going to be, whenever Raven comes on, she's going to be our consultant or correspondent for Our Issues in the News. So the Our Issues in the News segment is where Raven's going to be bringing us those points and those topics that are really important to Black women, women in general, mothers, as we need to stay in the know. So I appreciate her for taking on this role. And so Raven, what do you have for us this week?
So we have lots of political tea. We have tea for everybody today. Starting with, we're going to go through a couple updates that will feel both local and maybe really big picture and kind of break them down together.
Wonderful.
Starting with the State of the Union. So the State of the Union took place on March 1st, just a couple of weeks ago. And it was the president's first State of the Union since he took office. And what I like to kind of go through is just kind of see what was talked about. And so the president during the State of the Union talked about a bunch of family-friendly policies like paycheck fairness, the $15 minimum wage, extending the child tax credit, which many folks were able to take advantage of during the pandemic, but has now expired, as well as paid family leave, universal pre-K, and affordable housing. And the president also mentioned briefly preserving the right to choose, not mentioning abortion, but giving a large nod to it, as well as strengthening the Violence Against Women's Act, which we know was POTUS's legislative baby over 30 years ago. Also talked briefly about holding social media platforms accountable for the, quote, the national experiment they're conducting on children for profit and cracking down on privacy protections, as well as advertising targeted to children. And that was the general overview of issues that POTUS covered. However, when we talk about what that means, and for each segment, we'll talk about what happened, what it means, and what's going to happen next. And so what that means is when you put the legislative process, how bills get passed into law, I like to put it in terms of dating, which is the State of the Union is when someone states their intentions, right? I intend to look for a long-term partner. I intend to do X, Y, and Z, right? The State of the Union is when someone says, this is what I intend to focus on for the year. This is what I want to focus on. But what we know is that like what we say our intentions are and what ends up happening are two separate things. And so they're more so of like, this is my intention for the year. This is what I want to focus on. And in the terms of State of the Union, it's like, this is what we want Congress to focus on, because the president can really just say, hey, like, this is what I want to focus on. This is what I want to turn into law. But it's a whole process, which we'll actually talk a little bit about today, to get that into a policy that turns into something that we will feel. So he has to ask them, hey, please focus on these issues. But it does not mean that they're all going to happen the way we would like them to. And so as far as what's next, the president will release a budget, which is, again, another stating of like priorities, only this time we're like putting numbers next to them. And then recently the White House put out a COVID preparedness plan, basically saying, these are the things that we need in order to continue to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. That set of issues was initially going to be put into like a government funding bill that kind of, we see every once in a while, like the government could shut down, right? Those bills that keep the government going are called like supplemental spending bills. Initially, the COVID-19 aspect, which included some emergency paid leave and a couple other of protections, was initially going to be put into that. And what happened is the legislators, as they're figuring out what they want everything to look like, couldn't decide on what the pay for would be, how we would pay for the COVID-19 plan. And so therefore it was put on hold. And so a lot of those protections, some of the things that were mentioned in the State of the Union, are kind of in the balance right now as we figure out what the next legislative vehicle is for them. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. We can always talk about that more in the podcast, is like, what does it mean for something to be important enough to be passed and turned into law? And what does that look like? And how can we affect it? But for now, a lot of these issues that are really important to us are kind of in the balance. They're holding right now.
Gotcha.
And then, and I'm sure folks have seen a lot about this in the news, but we have a new SCOTUS nomination for the Supreme Court of the United States, which is really, really exciting. Oh my gosh, so exciting. The president nominated Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson on February 25th to replace Justice Breyer on the Supreme Court, who's retiring. And just a little bit about her so we can kind of talk about the significance. But Judge Jackson was DC born and Miami raised, which is really cool. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College and cum laude from Harvard Law before serving as a law clerk for Justice Breyer, which is pretty cool. She then served as a public defender for 2 years and then worked on the U.S. Sentencing Commission for 4 years, working to reduce sentencing disparities, which I think is a really interesting part of her resume. She currently serves on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, in which she was just recently confirmed by this current Senate that we have on June 4th, 2021. And that's also very significant. And we will talk a little bit about that as well. So what this means, and I think we all intuitively, as women of color, like we know what this means, but just to state it out loud, Judge Jackson will be the first Black woman to serve on the Supreme Court. And she will also be the first former public defender. So someone that has worked with people on the ground and is acutely aware of the criminal justice system and how it disproportionately affects people of color. And I think that is absolutely crucial. She will also be the only Black liberal justice and the only liberal justice with children. Her kids are 16 and 20. And I think that's also going to be a really important perspective that she brings, because right now we only have one Black justice on the court who is a conservative justice, as well as one justice with children who is a very conservative justice as well. And so I think this will provide a very balanced opinion. It's also important to note, as far as significance in this moment, while her nomination is significant, her impact on the court will grow over time. Right now, with this conservative majority that we have, it's very unlikely that she will be able to write like a majority opinion, right? Because we don't have a majority. But as we've seen with Justice Sotomayor, who's been able to write these incredible dissents that really put like a thumb, like a pulse to how the country and people are feeling about some of these crazy things we've seen in the Supreme Court, she will likely be able to do that and continue over time as she serves for potentially a couple of decades on the court. And a fun fact that I'd love to share is that there are almost twice as many white men named John who have served on the Supreme Court compared to all the women and all of the people of color combined on the court. Wow. So, yes. Another fact that I'm sure we intuitively know, but like just to say it out loud is like, wow. And so as far as what's next for the Supreme Court, hearings will be held next week, March 21st through 24th. There will be a vote to confirm. We need 50 votes plus the vice president to confirm Judge Jackson. And then we also want to take a look at how the media and lawmakers are talking about this future justice. And I know there are some organizations, I know like NARAL, coalitions like We Demand More, who you can follow on Instagram and Twitter. Mm-hmm. They are doing a lot of work to kind of talk about how are we talking about this justice, and are we focusing on her qualifications, and kind of keeping track of that conversation. I think it's going to be really interesting for us to watch and see how people continue to talk about her. And all of she's actually she's actually more qualified than I think, or has the most, how should I say this, has more judicial experience than some of the existing justices. So yes. And so then, and actually, Anna, do you want to chat a little bit, or do you want me to keep going with all that?
Well, I do. I want to chime in about Judge Brown Jackson. Yes. Okay, I was like, did I say it right? I always get hyphens backwards. But what stood out to me when I first heard about President Biden nominating her is that, going back to the one Black conservative justice that we have, is that President Biden was an integral part of bringing, I don't know, when Justice, what is his name? Clarence Thomas, yes. Yeah. President Biden was integral in bringing Justice Thomas in front of Congress back when he was nominated and was being voted to become a justice because of Anita Hill. And so I think it speaks to, on both ends, there's a lot to be said about the fact that was back in the late 80s, early 90s. Like, I was a little girl when that happened. And so there's a lot to be said about the fact that for this long, there has not been another Black nominee, right? Yeah. But I think that also I just appreciate President Biden's stance on ensuring that Black women are seen and heard, and that who we really are rings true, right? And so, that was a note that I was like, wait, it was Biden who was all in the mix.
Yeah. And it's crazy to see that continue, how that string of time and how things have played out over time. I think it's wonderful just to be able to say, to recognize, to your point, that when you make Black women visible, it means making them visible at the highest doors of power, right?
Exactly.
Not just the door down the street, but the one where they're making the
big decisions, yes, affecting policies, affecting laws. And I'm excited to see, once she is confirmed, I'm just, it's going to happen, but I'm excited to see what changes come in the next 20 years, 20 to 30 years with her on the bench. So that's really exciting.
It is. And to your point, when someone is appointed to the Supreme Court, I think part of the reason why it is so important is because folks are going to be there for decades, right? And so it's almost like a fossil, it's like a footprint. And we might not see the impact immediately, but we will definitely see it over time.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, I mean, we've already seen and felt Justice Sotomayor on the Supreme Court. You know, like you said, she might not be making those big decisions, but her notes of dissent are I think you're exactly right that it speaks to exactly what the public is feeling and thinking at that time. And so it's going to be wonderful to have not only another woman of color, but specifically a Black woman and a Black woman who is a working mother. And that for me is what just like makes the deal that much sweeter.
Yes. And just like even like smaller side note, it's like to see a Supreme Court justice with locks.
I know.
What? What? Just I can't help but just be a little giddy. To be able to be like, yeah, like she looks like us. Like this is amazing, you know, just to see ourselves in her. So I'm very excited about that, and I'm hopefully by the next time we talk, we'll have some updates, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
So a couple of next, kind of turning the page a little bit, to talk about some legislation that's been moving. Just as of recently. So the Job Protection Act, which I think is really important for all of us, because it basically talks about the right to take leave, to take care of yourself, family members and child, parents, and be able to keep your job. So, and we will talk about this a lot because as you guys know, paid leave is my baby. Love to talk about it. But right now in the United States, we do not have federally mandated paid leave. So employers are not required to pay you to be able to take leave, to take care of yourself, your spouse, your children, anything of that regard. However, we do have unpaid leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act, commonly known as Fmla. And on March 3rd, Representative Lauren Underwood introduced the Job Protection Act, which will allow folks to take leave without having to fear that they will be let go from their job while taking leave. So there will be no penalty. Currently, and also it will slightly expand the amount of folks who are eligible to take a Family Medical Leave Act, which is great.
Okay.
Because currently only 56% of the workforce, has access to unpaid family leave under FMLA. And so between that and also your leave not being protected, it makes it incredibly hard for it to be accessible, right? And so this bill makes it safer to take leave, meaning that you will have your job when you come back, but it also increases the amount of employers that are subjected to the requirements of FMLA. So right now, if you are a small business of 50 or less, which is a huge percent of the workforce, about 45% of the workforce, you are currently not included. So if you work for a small business, if you work for the mechanic down the street, or if you work at the doctor's office, a small local practice, like you're most likely not able to have FMLA. And so now it changes that from employers of 50 or more to employers of 1 or more. So it kind of opens the tent for everybody.
Okay.
Which is really important. And so as far as what's next for that, and this is where we kind of cue like the Schoolhouse Rock. I don't know if y'all remember like the bill.
I'm a bill on Capitol Hill.
Yes. Cue the music. Yeah, that's it. After a bill is introduced, like the Job Protection Act was on March 3rd, the bill sponsors continue to get co-sponsors, which is actually really important because it kind of signals like these are all the people who are very much in support of this bill to the point where they will co-sponsor it. And that is continuously happening. While that's happening, the bill will sit in committee. So in Schoolhouse Rock, it talks about how a bill can just sit there in committee, it can collect dust, just hang out there. And it will hang out there until it's voted on in committee. And if it's passed in committee, it will then go out to the floor of the House for a vote.
Okay.
If it's passed in the House, it will then be sent to the Senate. If it's passed in the Senate, it will then the bill will walk right up to the White House and get signed. And so currently, due to our composition in the Senate, it's very difficult for really anything, but particularly bills like this, to be signed into law. And so what's happening is like the folks who have sponsored the bill and advocates are working to kind of increase momentum and get this thing out of committee and get it passed. But that will take time. And so it's something that we're also going to have to kind of watch and monitor together. But if passed, could really like affect all of us. It's particularly like our clients as doulas and folks who currently aren't able to like, or either are scared to take Fmla or currently don't have access to it.
And that's the part that is, I have a lot of clients over the last couple of years whose workplaces have started to implement their very good maternity leave policies, for them. But what I'm finding is that those who probably need it the most, those who are in like public service positions like teachers, they still stand to gain a lot from legislation like this. And those who are working in I don't want to be offensive, but like the lower paying jobs, like those are the people who have the least amount of protection. And so seeing this type of legislation is only going to help that many more families. And I also like that, you bring up that it covers more than it's about more than maternity leave, that it's about the leave that we need to take for ourselves, that it's about caregiver leave, because a lot of times women, we find ourselves not only being the primary caretaker in our own family and household, but they are also often taking care of their elderly parents or other elder family members.
Exactly. And so this is another piece that we'll talk about another time, but changing widening the definition of family under the FMLA is something that advocates are also working on to make sure, to your very point, that like folks are able to take leave for whoever they need to take leave for without having to explain it for so many reasons. And so the Job Protection Act doesn't actually do that currently, but the goal is to widen the definition of family so that it's much easier for folks to say, hey, I'm going to take care of my grandmother today because I need to do that. And I am her primary caregiver. And so without having to go through all the steps of proving, proving that you're a relative and all that stuff to make it make sense.
Yeah. And it just reminds me of, I've seen it floating around on social media lately. There's this this meme or someone's tweet that's gone viral saying that, we're expected to work as if we're not mothers, and we're expected to mother as if we're not workers. And so,
oh my God.
And legislation like this, what it does is it's a check on treating people like human beings.
Yes. Something that we always say at my job is like paid leave and family leave allows you to choose between your life and your livelihood. Like you don't have to choose between making a paycheck and doing and like living your life and taking care of your loved ones. Like no one should have to make that choice. But in America, for whatever reason, it's a choice that folks have had to make. And we're one of the only countries who force people to do that on a regular basis.
It's true.
It's ridiculous. But, on that same vein, and this is actually maybe like it's a good story out of DC. So locally, just a hop, skip, and jump from where I currently am in Old Town, DC recently enacted a really wonderful change to their paid leave policy. So which is wonderful, it's really exciting. So paid family leave in DC was enacted in July 2020. And at that time, you had access to about 2 weeks of care for pregnancy, around 8 weeks to bond with a new child, 6 weeks to care with a family member with a serious health condition, and 6 weeks to care for your own serious health condition. So when this bill was passed last year, the city council basically said, hey, chief financial officer for the city, please take a look at the revenue and the expenditures of this bill, see how much we spend, and come back to us and tell us if we have money left over, if we have money we can decrease the employer tax rate, which is what pays for this bill, and tell us if we can actually extend benefits. And so the CFO took a look and just like about 2 weeks ago said, hey, there's money left over. This benefit is actually so efficient that we can expand it so that folks can have 12 weeks for each of these reasons to take leave, and up to 2 weeks for prenatal leave, which is huge. And so what this means is that like the program costs less than was expected. And that can happen for a number of reasons. Basically, policy experts like price the bill and say, this will cost this much. But until it's enacted and kind of put to pavement, we don't know how much it's actually going to cost. And so basically now it's been able to be expanded so that as of July 1st, folks will have access to 12 weeks of paid family leave.
So we have a pilot program and we get to see how this works out, and then we'll know what to do for the rest of the nation, right?
Yes, and this is another thing that we can always talk about more, but there are, I think, about 10 to 12 states that currently have a paid leave policy. A lot of them, and if we had a map, you'd see that they're spread out on either end of the country. So we have like Colorado, we have California, and then we also have states like Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York. And so we don't have, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of states in the middle of the country that have yet enacted, or in the South that have enacted a paid leave policy. So it adds to the number of places where folks are having access to leave, which adds to the case for a federal policy, which is just, so important. And I'm sure being here, we will talk a lot about this, but I really do think it is like the lifeblood. And also like after experiencing a pandemic, we have experienced no greater reasons.
That is so true.
You have to be able to take care of our loved ones and ourselves and still have a job. Like this pandemic is like, we didn't know why.
Now we know.
Don't know. Now you know.
That's for sure, because we saw it. I mean, last year, people were teaching their own children, working, having to care for parents who had become ill, or just trying to make sure their parents didn't become ill. It was a doozy for sure.
And overwhelming. And so now we know. We didn't know before we know. And so that's kind of so we've talked a little bit about kind of big federal news. We've talked about some legislative stuff. And now we're going to talk a little bit about some recent happenings with like gender and sexuality. And these ones, I will say before we even get started, just harder. These are harder to talk about. We're going to first talk about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And I can't even. So the Florida Senate passed a bill on Tuesday. And the formal name of the bill is the Parental Rights in Education Bill, that would prohibit classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in the state's primary schools. So we're talking kindergarten through fourth grade. The measure is also dubbed by its opponents as the Don't Say Gay bill. And I can talk a little bit about the importance of naming of these pieces of legislation really shortly. But it was passed last month in the House, and now after passing the Senate last week, heads to Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' desk, who has previously expressed support for it. So it's likely that he will sign this piece of legislation into law. And when we talk about what this means, there are a couple of different ways to interpret it. And so if we zoom out, this bill, for supporters of it, they'll say that it's about allowing parents to have control of what their kids are being taught in the classroom. While opponents will say, like, hey, this this unfairly targets LGBTQ children and community. The measure specifically, if we're looking at the legislative text, bans classroom, and I quote, classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity in kindergarten through third grade. It also prohibits, and I quote, teaching in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students, which if we're kind of zooming back out to say, that's a very broad. That is incredibly broad. And so critics say that that could actually be interpreted to not only include K through third grade, but also all grade levels. And the repercussions for this is that like parents can sue school districts for alleged violation. So as you can imagine, it encourages schools to be really careful in what they're teaching and to scale back on certain types of curriculum. And so the bill also intends, I think, to keep parents informed about their child's gender and sexuality before the kid actually is able to talk to their parents about it. It actually, there's a section, and I quote, requires the school to adopt procedures for notifying a student's parent if there is a change in the student's services that they are receiving or monitoring related to a student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being, and the school's ability to provide a safe and supportive learning environment for the student. And I quote. In other words, it means that if the student is questioning their gender or sexuality at school, the parents need to be informed. And so this is all a lot of like coded language, a lot of things that sound great, but actually are just a way to like continue to target LGBTQ students and young students in this regard. We're talking, you know, ages 6 through 10.
Yeah.
And I just can't even, there's so many places I go for this. I think the first place I go with this is when I joined the Army. It was a long time ago, but when I joined the Army, there was this, I think it was just a military policy, but the policy was called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And under that, it was that, you know, no one was to question anyone about their sexuality or identity, but if you were found out to be gay or identify as some other, you could, like, the hammer could come down on them. And as we know, a lot of people who join the military are joining the military for like upward mobility, right? Like they're coming from poor areas. And I just recall a few of my battle buddies like hiding and being terrified that somehow or some way or another they were going to be found out, you know, or that someone that they thought they could trust would end up outing them, and then it would ruin everything for them. And so I'm looking at that with this, and it's like, this is going to put that amount of burden on young children and on the families. And here's the thing, not just the families who are supportive and open to who their children are identifying to be or choosing to, or not even choosing, because that's not the right wording, but who are living as they are. But it also makes it problematic and dangerous, I dare say, for those whose parents are not open. And so if the school is calling home to report that someone's child, it's like, what type of danger are we sending that child home to then?
Yeah,
that's my biggest
concern.
Absolutely. And I think you're right when you say it's dangerous, because it is. We are taking away safe spaces from children. And whenever you do that, in whatever regard, it becomes more dangerous. And so there is a part in the bill that does, and I quote, allow folks to, allow school officials to withhold such information. And what it says, and I'll quote here, allows teachers to withhold such information from a parent if a reasonably prudent person would believe that disclosure would result in abuse, abandonment, or neglect. So there is a small section that does touch on this. However, when you look at the intention of the bill, that does not make it any less dangerous, right? That's a very small loophole that then is on the burden is on the school to prove, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
how would you know until you know, especially if we're talking about a kindergartner, you know?
yeah, right. And these are folks that haven't been they're in the school district, they haven't been there that long. Teachers don't know them as well. You know, it's different if we're talking about, you know, folks who are in the same, which is not the case for everybody, in the same school district from K to middle school to high school. That's different. But this is not what we're talking about, right? And so it does, like you said, it creates, I think, an incredibly dangerous environment and a horrible precedent for how we talk. And really, it's frankly a backstep to like how we handle gender and sexuality in our country. And so basically, as far as what's next, there was an amendment by Democrat Chevron Jones, who was the first openly gay Florida state senator, who urged his colleagues to narrow the bill's language to say that instruction should not be intended to change a student's sexual orientation or gender identity, so to make it more narrow. Mm-hmm. To like say, hey, like, let's talk about it, but the goal is not to, which is a falsity in itself, right? So he's saying, okay, like, can we narrow it to this thing that will then allow folks to talk about it? But that amendment failed. And that's not a surprise, but it is disappointing. Mm-hmm. And at least when asked about it, Governor Ketanji said that he would sign the bill into law with the state, and I'm going to quote him. He said, "We're going to make sure that parents are able to send their kid to kindergarten without having some of the stuff injected into their school curriculum." And I think when you look at, and I think that this is something that we can continue to talk about, is like when we see the titles of certain legislation, right? We go back to the title of this legislation, which is the Parental Rights and Education Bill. Part of what makes all of these issues that we're talking about so inaccessible is the language, and it's deceiving. Because we look at that and then we go down to the governor's quote and we see what the real intention of the bill is.
Right.
And I think that's really important for us to continue to think about. And that's why we're going to talk about it. That's why we're going to talk about it to get through all the, the windows and the things that don't seem super clear so that we can see it. And if the bill goes into law, if it's signed by the governor, it would go into effect on July 1st. So this would affect students in the following school year. And the other thing that I think we will continue to keep an eye on is that this bill does seem to be setting a trend as other states, including Georgia, Tennessee, Indiana, Oklahoma, and Kansas, have been considering similar laws on the state level. Okay. So we gotta keep an eye out.
And Texas has its own thing going on out here too, where
they could do a whole segment on Texas.
On Texas alone, right? But a few weeks back, our Governor Abbott put out this mandate, I'm going to call it, that people start reporting families that are raising transgender children and, allowing them to. And so all of this it honestly just feels like backlash from all of what was passed when President Obama was in office, and that these conservative states and conservative politicians are like they've got an axe to grind is honestly what it seems like from a public person standpoint, or not the public, from the public standpoint.
Yeah, and I think when we look at like the heteronormative kind of baseline that we've operated as in a country for many years, particularly like white heteronormative baseline that we've operated as, I think there's been a lot of backlash, right? Because the pendulum has kind of swung to the side where folks are beginning to be more open to create like policies that are inclusive. And now the pendulum is trying to swing. And we saw this with like the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And my understanding of like social policy in the world in general is that pendulum is normal, and we will continue to see kind of swings. But our goal, I think, as people who are affected by these policies, is to stand in the way of them and to say, hey, like, this is not okay. And we can always talk about how we can advocate against these things when they pop up, because they sure do be popping up.
Yes. And what we want to make sure is that we're always pushing forward in terms of progress and inclusion, and not being drug backwards.
Yes. And that's what we're seeing on the state level, which is actually, quite common when we see a, like, say, a more progressive or democratic president. We often see like lots of conservative state legislation pop up, and vice versa. That's actually quite normal in the States. And so we're seeing a lot of that right now.
That's good.
And then I just have one more issue for us to talk about. And this one is incredibly important, and hits me in the heartstrings every time I like talk about it or think about it. But we got to talk about Brittany Griner in Russia.
She's from right here in Houston, Texas. And
I didn't know that. I knew she was from Texas. I know she's from Houston. Yes. We have to talk about it.
Bring our girl home.
We sure do, yes. And so I'm sure as many folks have seen in the news, I hope you've seen in the news, that 7-time WNBA All-Star and 2-time Olympic gold medalist, I make a point to say this every single time, Brittany Griner was detained in a Russian airport on charges of possession of hashish oil. She had vape cartridges, essentially. And the New York Times first reported 2 Saturdays ago, that Griner was detained by the Russian Federal Customs Service in the airport after a canine unit detected that she had vape cartridges with cannabis oil in them. An investigation by the Customs Service was opened into allegations of like a large-scale transportation of drugs, which then was what is the charge that she is carrying. So it's actually a 10-year prison sentence that she could potentially be convicted of. And so this charge, this idea of large-scale transportation of drugs, actually, like, there's no bearings on it. But that is kind of what the Russian government is using to say, hey, this is why we're keeping her in prison. And so her, one of her representatives, Rep. Colin Allred, told CNN on Friday that Griner has been detained since about February 17th, which is about a month now, which is insane. But we did not hear about it up until about 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And so that when she was detained on February 17th, that was about 10 days before the Russian government announced that they would launch a full-scale invasion into Ukraine. And that timing, I think, is significant. Allred said that the U.S. Embassy in Moscow has actually not been able to been in contact with Griner, which is also a concern. And that is, he said, and I quote, extremely unusual in the case where Americans have been detained. And he said that that's concerning. And I quote, he says, the fact that we have not had official government contact with her to help her through this process. She is in touch with a Russian lawyer who is helping us understand the situation and working through the process. And that's really the state of where she's at with this whole detained and the legal process. But I think let's go ahead and kind of zoom out for a second and talk about what this means, right? So in the text of, we'll kind of do it in 2 seconds, but in the context of like the larger Russian invasion, the New York Times suggested that the arrest could be linked to the Russians' effort to create a leverage for potential prisoner exchange with the Ukrainian government or a reduction in sanctions related to the Ukraine invasion. Mm-hmm. Representative Jackson Lee also mentioned that she was concerned that this could be a connection. We can't ignore it. Is kind of what she was getting at. And everyone has kind of been urging, like, hey, we need to get her home. So her local representatives have been fighting for her. And then I think we have to zoom out as a gender, race, and equity issue. And so another concern for Griner is that she is a Black queer woman imprisoned in wartime Russia.
Wartime Russia, when the president of Russia has said the reason he's starting this war is because of this homosexual stance. So we're seeing the same language that we're hearing with this Don't Say Gay bill here in the United States over in Russia. And that's where Brittany is caught up.
Yeah, and I think that connection of the dots on it is so important. So thank you for connecting that for me, because I think that the Russian government has had a history. In 2013, they put into law that would ban the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships. So basically, non-heterosexual sexual relationships to minors, particularly, was the bill he signed in 2013. And then last month, the Russian Ministry of Justice tried to shut down one of the country's most active and prominent gay rights groups, the Russian LGBT network. And that was just last month. And then in 2019, 2 people were actually killed and 40 others detained during a crackdown of the LGBTQ community in a Russian city. And so this is, once again, a dot that we can't deny, and it increases the amount of danger that Brittany's in. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, and I think this is something, when I saw this story break on, I think I first saw it on the Shade Room. Shade Room is a very interesting place. Like, you go into the comments, you don't know what you're going to find, but I love to look at the comments. I'm sure many people do. And so one of the things I saw was, why is she in Russia? Why is she in Russia? Why is she there? Let's talk about the gender wage gap.
Yeah, no, seriously.
So there's actually a really excellent reel on the Instagram page called Queerency. They do a lot of work around queer justice and economic justice. They're really interesting. And the creator of that page did an excellent reel explaining this. But so since 2014, Brittany has been playing in Russia to supplement her income. In 2014, she started playing for the Russian powerhouse, and I'm not going to say the name exactly correct, but UMMC in Ekaterinburg, in the Russian Women's Premier Basketball League. And she played along a rotating group of a bunch of well-known WNBA stars, including Breonna Stewart, Joelle Jones, and Ali Quigley. Also, notably, Diana Taurasi has played for this team up until 2017. So we're talking about some of the best basketball players in our country have been playing overseas, and particularly even playing for this Russian team. And so this year, Griner is set to take home a league maximum of $227,000 from her salary for the Phoenix Mercury. And with the potential to earn up to like $500K between bonuses and marketing opportunities. And however, she, for playing at UMMC, she earns about $1 million per season. So that is significant. So she like almost over doubles her income just by playing an extra season. And as far as what's next, before we can actually, let me just talk a little bit more about the significance. The average, do you want to take a guess, Anya? What is the average salary for a NBA player in the US?
NBA, meaning so men. They started $1 million. At least, right? Yeah. Their average salary is, I wouldn't know, but
yes. So the average salary for an NBA player is $8.25 million.
That's average.
Yes, that's average.
That's even the bet. That's not LeBron. That's not Steph Curry. That's not. Nope. These are like, wow.
Average. Yeah, this is like anything from your 6th man on the bench to your 12th man on the bench to a LeBron. That's taking them all together and saying this is what the average makes. Mm-hmm. And then in the WNBA, the average salary is about $120,000. I'm laughing, but I'm not laughing. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so just to I say that to kind of show you the giant disparity here, that even like our Olympic gold medalists have to go overseas to make more money when you think about how much their male counterparts are making. And even though the highest paid are actually only like 7 players that make what Brittany makes, but the starting salary, a minimum salary for a WNBA player is like $60,000. And so you think about that range, like we're talking about 2 different entire ballgames, 2 different entire living styles here. And so I think when we go back to why was Brittany in this situation to start with? To make more money, because we don't pay our female athletes enough in this country. And so I think when we zoom out, like, why was she here in the first place? Well, let's talk about the wage gap.
Yeah, it just, there's so much conversation around the difference in sports. And I know a lot of times people try to simply reduce it to, well, men's sports have more ticket sales and women's sports are not bringing in. But I think then we have to ask, well, why is that? Are we pushing, for women's sports to be out there? That is the unfortunate tragedy of, although Kobe Bryant is not the only person who was working at it, but the unfortunate tragedy of his untimely death, because he was working really hard to bring equality between men and women's sport. So I think what I was saying is that I know that there are women who were fighting for this, and especially women athletes who were fighting for this long before Kobe was, and they're going to continue in this fight. They're continuing in this fight long after Kobe is gone. But he was such a huge voice, right? And had the power, so much power and influence behind his voice that could have just like pushed this. So I'm really glad that you brought this to an understanding of that wage gap and why that drives our female athletes to have to go overseas, to have to go to these places that, she was in a place that's not safe for her, even if they were not in wartime.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. To make the decision, right? I think when we talk about like money, I've also heard the thing, well, like that are like $227K is a lot, but like at the same, and it is, but at the same time, it's a lot for some. But when you think about like when you sign up to be a doctor, right? Like you want to make what you signed up to make as a doctor, right? Yeah. And it shouldn't matter your gender or how many people, how exciting being a particular type of doctor is, right? I'm just taking a different type of analogy, but to your point, it is more than about, oh, we just don't get enough fans. Like people just aren't as excited about it. No, I think that's a systemic problem.
I also think it's interesting that it's kind of a reverse thing between male and female athletes in this country, is that we see women athletes have to leave the country to make fair wages. But we don't, like, when men are leaving the country to play sports, they're going out of the country and making far less than what those athletes here. And so I don't know what that is, or, I'm not in depth enough in the sports world to understand why, but again, to the disparity.
To your point, and my understanding is that the WNBA, like these salaries are negotiated with the Players Association to create more equity. And like, that's why they are so like, this is what they are. Like Brittany, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, they all make the players super max in the WNBA. That's like the max you can make. That's for players like them who are so talented, have been around for a long time. But also just to point out, and this is like the last fact, is that folks like Diana Taurasi, folks like Sue Bird have been playing for almost 20 years. That's a long time to be making a salary like this, right? Like that's a long career and that's hard on our bodies. But by this wage gap, we're asking women to do more, to expend their energy, right? So they're not taking breaks. They don't have an off season like the men do. But then also to, hey, like go overseas to a place that may or may not actually be safe and welcoming for you, affirming for you, to make the same amount of money, and still less than your male counterpart.
Yeah. And let me tell you, I'll give this one little bit of tea, but I often talk about how my son Bryce plays for the Houston Dynamo Academy, and which is the professional MLS soccer team here in Houston, and their women counterparts are the Houston Dash. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was dropping Bryce off, and they're putting up this new netting. And they're just, the Dash have been here for some years now, and they're just now getting their own field. So the first team for the men, they have their own field. It's netted off. No one can go over there. And the women professional team has had to share fields with the youth, the academy, and the youth teams. And so a couple of weeks ago, I'm dropping him off and I see them put up the netting. I was like, what's going on? He's like, oh, the Dash are getting their own field now. But to even think that, like,
we have to say that and have to do that in the year of 2022.
and I'm like, they're professional, just like the men are professional. Why haven't they been able to share the professional field with the men? But again, yeah.
Here we are. Yeah, I completely understand. I played sports all my life and ran track in college for 4 years. So this is very close to my heart as well. And I'm like, it's something that we gotta do better.
Yeah. I'm just hoping we can get Brittany home and get her home safe and soon.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's all I have.
Raven, we did. That was so much. Tell us, Ray. I want the audience, I want our listener friends. So that's what I call them, our listener friends, or sometimes you'll hear me say LFs. Yeah. So just tell our listener friends a little bit more about you. You know, like, how did you get into doing the political work that you do, or working for the government like you do? What has been your interest? What do you do for fun?
Oh, okay. I love all these. So let's see. So I have always, in college, like you mentioned, I studied women and gender studies, and I initially thought like I wanted to be a doctor, right? And that's actually, you know, I'll explain a little bit, but like I always knew I wanted to like work with people. I wanted to make a positive impact on folks. Like I liked the kind of like helping, serving professions, whatever you prefer to call them. But took me a while to figure out like what my like gifts were. And so when I found the gender studies department, it was like an elective class that frankly, as an athlete, my advisor put me in because she thought it would be easy and thought it would be a class that I would like be able to, you know, balance it with sports well, which happens a lot.
Okay.
And so, but I fell in love with it. And it was this one professor who was just like, hey, like, let's look at how all these things are socially constructed. Like, let's talk about all these heteronormative things that we live in that we don't even know, because it's like the water that we we swim in.
Yeah.
Right. It's like water to fish. And so like, it kind of just like completely blew my mind, but honestly changed how I wanted to like exist, like in my life professionally and like in general. And so I realized like, hey, like being a doctor is like not my gifts. Like God did not give me gifts for chemistry and calculus and physics. No. But I eventually found my way from psych to then social work. So when I went home, finished school, I ended up focusing on social work. And I was like, I started actually being a social work intern. And for those who are from the Philadelphia area, where I'm originally from, in Chester, Pennsylvania, which is like the school district in the area at the time, I think had like a 56% graduation rate.
Ooh.
Yes. And like incredibly underserved community, didn't have a grocery store at the time, was a food desert. And I was working here knowing that I was getting closer to always what I wanted to do, but like I was still frustrated by the systemic issues that my clients were experiencing in Chester, that I didn't feel like I was even being effective as like a clinician. Mm-hmm. Like it was really hard to say, and I was working with children at the time. I was like, it's really hard for me to think about spending 35 minutes with a 5-year-old when I know that they're going back to an overcrowded kindergarten classroom with no aid and a crisis manager instead of a guidance counselor? Like, how can I continue to do that? And so I kind of was like, once again, felt like I was being pulled necessarily away from doing the clinical work and to like doing larger advocacy. And so I switched over to what we call macro social work, which is kind of the advocacy stuff, and continue to focus on like gender issues. And when I started to do that, I found more joy, but then missed like people and being connected. I've always kind of wanted to sit in the middle between the larger like change work that needs to be done and like what folks actually experience on the ground. And so in social work, we call that like a meso social worker, like sitting literally in the middle between the micro and the macro. And I realized that that's really where I enjoy being. And so as I continue to get into like gender policy at the Law Project, I've then found this amazing New York Times article about doulas. And it was talking about Sister Song, and a couple of other like New York, Mama Glow, a couple other places, this article. And it honestly was like, that's it. That's the other piece of my puzzle.
I feel like that's how most doulas come into it. We're like looking for something and things aren't working out with where we are. And we're like, there we go. That's where I can make a difference.
It just clicked and I could not get it out of my head. I signed up for a training. I went to Brooklyn. I couldn't find one in Pennsylvania that was taught by a woman of color, which was also really important to me. So I went all the way to Brooklyn just to do this training. And it shifted everything for me. And so since then, I've really been like finding my kind of stride, working in both the advocacy space and also keeping like connected to like my community as a doula. And now like my goal really is to continue working on policies that will affect my clients. And so that's kind of how I got into like political work, but really always making sure that the reason why I ended up joining the Warren campaign was for her maternal health policy. Just like that she was one of the only candidates to like have a drawn out, like this is what we can do to address the maternal health crisis. And that then led me to my time at Paid Leave for All. And so I've kind of just been following the policy train of like things that will affect my clients and kind of enjoying to be in the middle, like bridging the gap. Even what I'm able to do with y'all today is like literally allowing me to do that. And so that's kind of how I've gotten into this work and why I'm so happy to be here.
And I just want to say, back to your work with Warren for All, I believe that's where our connection came from, because you met Andre Wagner.
Yes.
Who, listener friends, if you remember a couple of episodes back, we spoke with Aurelia Wagner, who is Andre's sister.
Yes.
Them from college. And so I just love that, like he put you in touch with me, and this is the work, right? This is how we
Yes. Yes, and we both got to like volunteer for the inauguration a couple of years ago together. And we were sitting there waiting for everything to happen. And we just turned to each other. We're like, yeah, we were both working together. He was in Texas. I was in North Carolina. And then I was like, yeah, we'll do it. He's like, wait. Like, and he immediately pulls up your Instagram. And that's how we got connected. And ever since,
love it.
We've been chatting. So that's how I've gotten to this work. And I really enjoy kind of staying at that intersection between policy and people. Yeah.
Good. What do you do on your downtime? What's your like number one, let down your hair, let down your locks?
Yes. So I enjoy like aerial art. So I do like the Lyra. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. Like if you've seen like Cirque du Soleil, I promise you it's like really cool and not hard, but because yes, it's like a metal hoop connected to the ceiling and you like do cool things in it. And so being a former athlete, and I'm very retired. If you ask me like, oh, do you still run? The answer is absolutely not. Never. Like I have a pair of running shoes, but they're to walk. And that's because I feel like I'm kind of like, trying to take care of my knees. But like, honestly, I don't. So I was always looking for something to do after school. And I always kind of wanted to dance. But my parents were always kind of like, no, like do a sport. You're not going to dance. You're going to do. And at that time, they kind of saw like, nope, like you're going to do a sport. They kind of like feminized dance as like this thing. And I'm grateful for sports. I love them dearly.
Mm-hmm.
But now that I'm grown, I've been kind of like, enjoying exploring some of those kind of like dancey arts where there's this like mix of strength and creativity.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Yes, you're gonna be like, who? Pink, Pink, who's like,
Yes, she did silks, and silks are that's another one that I really want to try soon. Aerial silks.
that's amazing. Yeah. Oh, fun stuff. Well, Raven, I am so happy to have you on board with the Doing Motherhood podcast. Everything that you brought to us today, I'm just like, listener friends, this is what we have to look forward to. We're going to be able to stay in the know, and particularly with, that information that directly touches us. And so that's what I hope that everyone will get out of this. And Raven, I'm just really happy to have you on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, listener and friends. I'm excited to get to know y'all more. And I'm excited to hear about what y'all want to hear from me, like what we want to talk about and learn about together. So thank y'all so much.
Yeah. And tell them, Raven, where can they find you if they're interested in following the work that you do?
Yeah, so Instagram and Twitter, at Raven, Raven, like the bird, M Dorsey, Dorsey, on both Instagram and Twitter.
Love it.
Well, you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be talking soon.
You too.
Bye.